Most people never see this coming, but it changes everything completely. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn, shifting from polite discussion into a moment that makes everyone in the studio sit up a little straighter? Make sure to subscribe to Table Turn and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. What viewers tuned in for that morning looked, at least on the surface, like a standard daytime segment. The panel was welcoming a high-profile guest, Angelina Jolie, to talk about her latest humanitarian work and a film project that tied loosely into themes of global responsibility and social awareness. The atmosphere at the top of the show was relaxed in the way daytime television usually is. There were smiles, light laughter, and the familiar rhythm of hosts greeting the audience, exchanging quick jokes, and setting the tone before getting into anything serious. Angelina Jolie entered to sustained applause, the kind that feels respectful rather than over the top. She greeted each panelist individually, exchanging a brief hug with one host, a handshake with another. When she reached Whoopi Goldberg, there was a warm exchange, a smile, and a quick comment about seeing each other again. To anyone watching at home, nothing about that moment hinted at tension. It looked like what it was supposed to look like, a friendly welcome between public figures who had crossed paths before. The conversation began where many daytime interviews do, with accessible topics. Jolie spoke about balancing motherhood with work, about traveling for advocacy projects, and about how her priorities had shifted over the years. The panel listened attentively, nodding, occasionally chiming in with short affirmations or follow-up questions. Whoopi, seated slightly angled toward Jolie, leaned back in her chair, hands loosely folded, listening with a neutral but engaged expression. The studio audience responded with soft laughter at light moments and polite applause when Jolie spoke about causes that resonated with them. As the discussion progressed, the tone subtly shifted toward more serious territory. One of the hosts asked Jolie about using celebrity platforms to speak on political or social issues, a question that's almost expected in interviews like this. Jolie answered thoughtfully, emphasizing the importance of listening, learning, and understanding complexity rather than speaking over people. Her delivery was calm, measured, and clearly practiced, but not rehearsed in a way that felt artificial. That answer opened the door to a broader panel discussion. Another host added a comment about celebrities being criticized for weighing in on topics they're perceived not to fully understand. Jolie nodded and responded by acknowledging that criticism, saying it was valid in some cases and that she tried to approach advocacy with humility. It was at this point that Whoopi entered the conversation more directly. Whoopi leaned forward slightly, placing her elbows on the table, and began by agreeing in principle. She talked about the responsibility that comes with having a microphone and an audience. Her voice was steady, conversational, and at first entirely aligned with what Jolie had been saying. The two seemed to be on the same page, reinforcing each other's points. The audience murmured in approval, a low hum of agreement that often fills the room during consensus moments. Then the conversation took a turn that was subtle enough you might miss it if you weren't paying close attention. Whoopi shifted from general agreement to a more pointed observation. She spoke about the difference between advocacy and moral positioning, noting that sometimes public figures unintentionally frame issues in ways that leave no room for disagreement. Her tone wasn't accusatory, but it was firmer, more deliberate. She made eye contact with Jolie as she spoke, not confrontationally, but directly. Jolie listened, nodding at first, but her posture changed slightly. She straightened in her chair, clasping her hands together in her lap. When Whoopi finished her point, there was a brief pause, the kind that happens live on television when everyone is deciding who will speak next. Jolie took that moment to respond. She clarified that her intention was never to present herself as morally superior, but rather to amplify voices she felt weren't being heard. Her voice remained calm, but there was a noticeable emphasis on certain words, signaling that she felt the need to be precise. The exchange remained polite, but the energy in the room had shifted. One of the other hosts attempted to smooth the moment by adding a comment about how nuanced these conversations can be. She smiled, gestured lightly with her hands, and tried to broaden the discussion. The studio audience responded with scattered applause, appreciative but tentative. Whoopi, however, wasn't finished. She nodded at the other host's comment, then returned to Jolie's point. She spoke about how television audiences interpret messages, especially when they come from well-known figures. She mentioned that intent doesn't always translate the way people hope, and that sometimes the way advocacy is framed can feel dismissive to those who see the issue differently. Again, her tone was measured, but there was an unmistakable seriousness now. Jolie responded by acknowledging that risk, saying it was something she thought about often. She added that silence also carries consequences, and that choosing not to speak can be interpreted just as strongly as choosing to speak. As she talked, she gestured lightly with one hand, her movements controlled but expressive. The camera cut briefly to the other panelists, whose expressions reflected focused attention. No one was interrupting, but everyone seemed aware that the conversation was moving into more delicate territory. The pacing of the segment slowed. There were longer pauses between comments, fewer overlapping voices. Whoopi tilted her head slightly as she listened, her expression thoughtful but unsmiling. When she replied, she agreed that silence can be powerful, but reiterated that the way messages are delivered matters just as much as the decision to deliver them. She used a personal example from her own career, describing times when she'd chosen to speak out and times when she'd held back. At this point, the studio audience grew noticeably quieter. The background reactions that usually punctuate daytime talk shows faded, replaced by attentive silence. You could feel that viewers were watching something more serious than the usual celebrity interview. The disagreement wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was clear. Two perspectives, both articulated calmly, were rubbing up against each other without fully aligning. One of the hosts attempted again to bridge the gap, suggesting that different approaches to advocacy can coexist. She smiled, looked between Whoopi and Jolie, and made a light comment about how passionate people can be when they care deeply. The audience responded with a small wave of applause, grateful for the momentary release of tension. Still, the underlying disagreement lingered. Whoopi acknowledged the comment, but returned once more to the idea of responsibility, emphasizing that with large platforms comes an obligation to consider how messages land with diverse audiences. Jolie listened carefully, then responded by saying that she believed discomfort can sometimes be a necessary part of progress. Her tone remained respectful, but her words carried conviction. As the segment approached its midpoint, the host managing the conversation gently steered things back toward Jolie's current projects, signaling a desire to keep the discussion from becoming too heavy. The shift was subtle but intentional. Jolie answered the new question, and Whoopi leaned back again, folding her hands and nodding along. The immediate tension eased, but the exchange had already made its impression. For viewers watching live, the moment stood out not because of raised voices or sharp words, but because of its authenticity. It felt like a real disagreement unfolding in real time, handled within the boundaries of daytime television. And as the cameras continued to roll, it was clear that the conversation had left both the panel and the audience thinking a little more deeply than they might have expected when the segment began. As the conversation moved forward, there was a noticeable effort by everyone at the table to reset the rhythm of the segment. That's something seasoned daytime television hosts do almost instinctively. After a moment of tension, they look for familiar ground, something accessible that allows both the guest and the panel to breathe again. The host, who had redirected the discussion earlier, followed up with a question about Jolie's recent travel for her humanitarian work, asking how those experiences inform the stories she chooses to tell through film. Jolie answered thoughtfully, describing visits to refugee camps and meetings with local organizers. Her tone softened slightly, and her posture relaxed as she spoke about listening more than talking during those trips. The camera alternated between close-ups of her and wider shots of the panel, and in those wider shots, Whoopi could be seen nodding along. At least on the surface, the two appeared aligned again, sharing space and a calmer exchange. The studio audience responded with quiet attentiveness, offering light applause at moments that emphasized compassion or shared humanity. It felt like the segment was settling back into a more familiar daytime groove. But there was still a sense that the earlier disagreement hadn't fully dissipated. It lingered beneath the surface, informing the way each comment was received and responded to. One of the other panelists jumped in with a follow-up that touched on how stories from global issues are translated for American audiences. She spoke about the challenge of making distant struggles feel relevant to people watching at home during their morning routines. Jolie responded by emphasizing storytelling as a bridge, explaining that film and media can help people connect emotionally to experiences they might never encounter firsthand. As Jolie spoke, Whoopi leaned slightly forward again, signaling that she was preparing to add something. When Jolie finished her sentence, Whoopi waited just a beat before speaking, a small but important pause that suggested she wasn't interrupting impulsively. She began by agreeing that storytelling is powerful, but then added that stories can sometimes oversimplify complex realities, especially when condensed for mainstream audiences. Her voice remained even, but there was a firmness to her delivery. She talked about how certain narratives can unintentionally reinforce stereotypes or leave out uncomfortable details. This wasn't framed as a critique of Jolie personally, but as a broader concern. Still, because of the earlier exchange, the audience could sense the underlying tension returning. Jolie listened carefully, her eyes focused on Whoopi as she spoke. When it was her turn to respond, she acknowledged the concern and said it was something she actively tried to avoid. She mentioned collaborating with local voices and experts to ensure authenticity. Her response was calm, but there was a slight tightening around her expression, the kind that suggests someone is being careful not to misstep. The pacing of the conversation slowed again. Each person spoke a little more deliberately, choosing words with care. One of the hosts attempted to inject a lighter note, joking briefly about how difficult it is to cover serious topics before noon. The audience laughed, grateful for the release, and even Whoopi cracked a small smile. Jolie smiled as well, and for a moment, the tension eased. But live television has a way of circling back to unresolved points, especially when the people involved feel strongly about them. As the laughter died down, Whoopi returned to the idea of responsibility, this time framing it through the lens of audience reception. She spoke about viewers who might feel talked down to or excluded by certain types of messaging. Her tone wasn't accusatory, but it was clear she was speaking from experience, perhaps even frustration. Jolie responded by saying she never wanted anyone to feel dismissed, but that she believed discomfort could be part of meaningful conversation. She emphasized that growth often comes from challenging perspectives. As she spoke, she gestured lightly, palms open, as if inviting dialogue rather than confrontation. The other panelists watched closely. One nodded in agreement with Jolie's point, while another shifted in her seat, preparing to step in if needed. The host managing the segment glanced briefly toward the clock, a subtle reminder that live television operates within strict time constraints. Still, she allowed the conversation to continue, sensing its importance. The studio audience was quiet again, listening intently. There were no murmurs, no applause, just focused attention. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy but respectful, where viewers are processing what's being said rather than reacting emotionally. Whoopi responded by acknowledging that discomfort can be valuable, but reiterated that the way it's introduced matters. She talked about meeting people where they are, rather than pushing them into positions they're not ready to engage with. Her delivery was calm, but there was a clear boundary being drawn. It wasn't an argument in the traditional sense, but a firm articulation of a different philosophy. Jolie nodded, taking in the comment. When she replied, she did so more slowly than before, choosing her words carefully. She said she believed both approaches had merit and that the challenge was finding balance. Her voice softened slightly, signaling a willingness to find common ground, even if complete agreement wasn't possible. At this point, the host stepped in more assertively. She thanked both Jolie and Whoopi for the thoughtful discussion and emphasized that these conversations are rarely simple. Her tone was warm but directive, clearly aiming to steer the segment back towards safer territory before it risked becoming too intense for daytime viewers. The conversation shifted again to Jolie's film project, with questions about production and creative choices. Jolie answered with ease, clearly comfortable discussing her work. Whoopi leaned back, her hands resting on the table, listening without interjecting. The other panelists engaged more actively, asking about behind-the-scenes details and personal inspiration. The audience responded positively, applauding at familiar beats. On the surface, it looked like the segment had moved on. But for attentive viewers, the earlier exchange continued to color the atmosphere. There was a slight stiffness in the interactions, a sense that everyone was being a bit more cautious. As the segment neared its end, the host offered Jolie an opportunity to share final thoughts. Jolie spoke about hope, collaboration, and the importance of continuing dialogue even when it's uncomfortable. Her words were inclusive, emphasizing listening and learning. The audience applauded warmly, appreciative of the message. Whoopi nodded along, and when the host turned to her for a closing comment, she offered a brief, measured response. She said she appreciated the conversation and believed that respectful disagreement was healthy. Her tone was calm, and she smiled lightly at Jolie as she spoke. The segment ended with polite applause and a sense of resolution, at least on the surface. Jolie thanked the hosts, exchanged brief goodbyes, and the show moved into a commercial break. But for viewers watching live, it was clear they had just witnessed something a little different from the usual daytime fare. It wasn't explosive or sensational, but it was real. And as the cameras cut away, there was a feeling that the conversation might not be over, even if the segment was. When the show returned from the commercial break, the atmosphere in the studio had subtly shifted. That's often the case after a segment that carries more weight than expected. The audience settled back into their seats, and the panel reset their posture and expressions, ready to move on to the next topic. But for viewers paying close attention, there was still a sense that the earlier exchange between Angelina Jolie and Whoopi Goldberg lingered in the air, influencing the tone of what followed. The host opened the next segment with a brief recap of the show's lineup, smoothly transitioning as daytime programs do. Jolie remained at the table, indicating that her appearance was continuing into this portion. The conversation initially focused on lighter ground, including Jolie's upcoming projects and how she chooses roles at this stage in her career. Her answers were relaxed, and the panel responded with curiosity and encouragement. Whoopi participated in this part of the discussion with a more observational tone, asking questions rather than offering commentary. Her body language was open but reserved. She leaned back in her chair, occasionally nodding, her hands resting calmly on the table. It gave the impression of someone who is consciously taking a step back, allowing the conversation to breathe. The studio audience responded with laughter at light moments and applause at familiar beats. On the surface, the show had returned to its usual rhythm. But live television often brings unresolved threads back into focus, sometimes unintentionally. In this case, it happened when one of the panelists referenced the earlier conversation while asking Jolie about criticism she's faced throughout her career. The panelist framed the question carefully, noting that Jolie has often been at the center of public debates, not just about her work, but about her activism. She asked how Jolie handles differing opinions, especially when those opinions come from people she respects. The question was asked gently, but it unmistakably echoed the earlier exchange. Jolie paused before answering. It wasn't a long pause, but it was noticeable. She took a breath, then spoke about the importance of separating critique from personal attack. She said she tries to listen, reflect, and adjust when necessary, but also stay grounded in her values. Her tone was thoughtful, and her gaze moved briefly across the panel before returning to the host who had asked the question. As Jolie spoke, the camera cut to Whoopi, who was listening intently. Her expression was neutral, but focused. When Jolie finished, Whoopi nodded slightly, then offered a response that built on the point rather than contradicting it. She spoke about the difference between disagreement and disrespect, emphasizing that strong opinions don't have to come with hostility. This moment felt like a conscious effort to reframe the earlier tension in a more constructive light. The audience responded with light applause, appreciative of the collaborative tone. One of the other hosts smiled and added a comment about how rare it is to see public figures discuss disagreement so openly on daytime television. The conversation flowed more smoothly for a few minutes, touching on resilience, public scrutiny, and personal growth. Jolie shared an anecdote about receiving conflicting feedback on a project and learning to discern which voices to prioritize. Whoopi responded with a brief story from her own career, echoing the theme without reopening earlier points of contention. Still, as the segment continued, the discussion naturally gravitated back toward broader social issues. One of the hosts referenced a recent news story related to international policy, framing it as a general topic rather than a direct continuation of the earlier debate. The host asked the panel, including Jolie, how they felt about the way these issues are discussed in mainstream media. Jolie answered first, speaking about the need for depth and context. She emphasized that quick sound bites often fail to capture the realities on the ground. Her delivery was calm but firm. As she spoke, Whoopi shifted slightly in her seat, her posture indicating engagement. When it was Whoopi's turn to respond, she acknowledged Jolie's point, then added her own perspective. She talked about the constraints of television, especially daytime formats, and how those constraints shape conversations. She mentioned the challenge of balancing nuance with accessibility, a point that subtly echoed her earlier concerns. The exchange remained respectful, but the contrast in their perspectives was clear. Jolie focused on the responsibility to expand conversations, even within limited formats. Whoopi emphasized the responsibility to avoid oversimplification and unintended alienation. Neither raised their voice. There were no interruptions. But the difference in approach was evident. The studio audience listened quietly, and the other panelists mostly held back, allowing the two voices to carry the discussion. Occasionally, a host would nod or murmur agreement, but no one jumped in to redirect immediately. It felt like the show was allowing the conversation to unfold organically, trusting the viewers to follow along. As the discussion progressed, Jolie made a point about trusting audiences to engage with complexity. She said she believed people are more capable of nuanced understanding than television often assumes. Her tone was earnest, and she leaned slightly forward as she spoke, signaling emphasis. Whoopi responded by saying she agreed in principle, but reiterated that not all viewers come to daytime television seeking that level of engagement. She talked about meeting audiences where they are, a phrase she repeated with gentle emphasis. Her delivery was calm, but decisive. This back and forth didn't feel like an argument so much as a philosophical divergence. The audience seemed to sense that as well. There were no gasps or dramatic reactions, just attentive listening. It was the kind of exchange that rewards patience rather than spectacle. Sensing the conversation's depth, the host stepped in again to acknowledge the thoughtful discussion. She thanked both Jolie and Whoopi for sharing their perspectives and noted that these are ongoing conversations without easy answers. Her tone was warm, and she smiled at both women, attempting to balance the moment. The show then transitioned to audience questions, a common daytime format move that often helps diffuse tension. A studio audience member asked Jolie about how she stays hopeful in the face of difficult global issues. Jolie answered with sincerity, speaking about community, small victories, and the importance of perseverance. The audience responded with applause. Whoopi added a brief comment about humor as a coping mechanism, eliciting laughter and easing the mood further. The panelists smiled, and the energy in the room lifted noticeably. As the segment drew closer to its end, the conversation returned to lighter topics, including Jolie's upcoming appearances and personal interests. The earlier tension felt more distant now, though not entirely forgotten. It lingered as a reminder of the complexity that had surfaced earlier. When the host thanked Jolie for staying through multiple segments, the audience applauded warmly. Jolie expressed her appreciation for the conversation and the opportunity to discuss meaningful topics. She made a point of thanking the panel collectively, her gaze briefly meeting Whoopi's. Whoopi nodded in return, offering a small smile. As the show moved into the latter portion of the hour, the pace naturally picked up. Daytime talk shows often do this, shifting from heavier conversations towards segments that feel more approachable as they move closer to wrapping things up. Angelina Jolie was still seated at the table, and while the earlier discussion wasn't being directly referenced anymore, it continued to influence the way everyone spoke and listened. The host introduced the next topic with a lighter tone, asking Jolie about how she chooses when to step back from public life. It was framed as a personal question rather than a political one, and Jolie responded with a relaxed smile. She talked about the importance of privacy, especially for her children, and about setting boundaries in a career that's often lived in public. Her tone was open and reflective, and the audience responded with knowing laughter and supportive applause. Whoopi listened quietly, her posture relaxed. She nodded at certain points, clearly relating to the idea of boundaries. When the host turned to her for a brief reaction, Whoopi shared a short comment about how protecting personal space becomes more important over time. It was a simple observation, and it landed easily with both the audience and the panel. For a few minutes, the conversation flowed smoothly. The panel asked about creative freedom, about saying no to projects, and about how Jolie measures success now compared to earlier in her career. Jolie answered with ease, and the exchange felt collaborative rather than tense. The audience's reactions were steady and warm, suggesting that the show had found its footing again. Then, almost inadvertently, the conversation brushed up against familiar territory. One of the hosts referenced the idea of public expectations, noting that audiences often expect celebrities to comment on major events. She asked Jolie how she decides when to speak and when to stay silent. The question was asked neutrally, but given what had already been discussed, it carried weight. Jolie paused briefly before answering. She spoke about listening first, about understanding context, and about recognizing that there are moments when speaking can help and moments when it might not. Her tone was careful, clearly shaped by the earlier discussion. She emphasized that there's no single formula and that she often reconsiders her choices in hindsight. As Jolie spoke, Whoopi watched attentively. When the host invited her to respond, Whoopi acknowledged Jolie's answer and added that self-awareness is key. She spoke about the pressure to always have a response and how that pressure can lead to missteps. Her delivery was calm, and notably, she avoided revisiting earlier points directly. The studio audience seemed to appreciate this more reflective tone. There was a soft murmur of agreement, followed by light applause. The energy in the room felt thoughtful rather than charged. One of the other panelists then offered a comment about generational differences in how public figures engage with issues. She spoke about social media, about immediacy, and about the expectation of constant commentary. Jolie nodded along, and when she responded, she spoke about learning to navigate those expectations while staying true to her values. Whoopi chimed in briefly, agreeing that the landscape has changed dramatically. She spoke about starting her career in a time when responses weren't expected instantly, contrasting that with today's environment. The tone of her comment was reflective, almost nostalgic, and it drew a warm response from the audience. At this point, it was clear that both Jolie and Whoopi were making an effort to find common ground. Their comments began to overlap in theme, if not always in approach. They both spoke about intention, impact, and the difficulty of navigating public discourse. The earlier tension had evolved into something more nuanced, a layered conversation shaped by experience. The host managing the segment acknowledged this shift, remarking that these are conversations without easy answers. She smiled and thanked both women for engaging so thoughtfully. Her tone was sincere, and the audience responded with applause. As the segment continued, the show moved into a short, lighter exchange, asking Jolie about upcoming travel plans unrelated to work. Jolie laughed softly as she answered, sharing a brief anecdote. The panel reacted with amusement, and even Whoopi joined in with a light comment that drew laughter from the audience. The mood had noticeably lifted. The stiffness that had followed the earlier disagreement was largely gone, replaced by a sense of mutual respect. While the differences in perspective hadn't disappeared, they no longer dominated the interaction. Still, for viewers paying close attention, the earlier exchange added depth to everything that followed. Each comment about responsibility or choice carried an extra layer of meaning. It felt less like a scripted interview and more like a real conversation unfolding live. As the show approached its final minutes, the host began to wrap up the segment. She thanked Jolie again for joining them and highlighted where viewers could learn more about her projects. Jolie expressed her gratitude, saying she appreciated the opportunity to talk about meaningful topics in a space that allows for discussion. Before the show moved on, Whoopi offered one final comment directed generally at the conversation rather than at Jolie specifically. She said she valued open dialogue and believed that respectful disagreement is part of a healthy society. Her tone was calm and sincere, and she looked briefly at Jolie as she spoke. Jolie nodded and smiled in response, saying she agreed. The exchange was brief but significant, signaling a shared understanding, even if not full agreement. The audience applauded warmly as the host transitioned to the next segment. Jolie waved lightly to the crowd, exchanged quick goodbyes with the panel, and the camera pulled back. For viewers at home, Part 4 reinforced that what they had witnessed wasn't a confrontation in the dramatic sense, but a genuine, unscripted moment of differing viewpoints handled in real time. As the show continued without Jolie, the panel shifted to other topics, but the earlier discussion remained part of the episode's fabric. It was the kind of moment that doesn't dominate headlines immediately but lingers with viewers, prompting reflection rather than outrage. And as the hour moved toward its close, it became clear that this exchange would be remembered not for what was said loudly, but for how it was handled quietly. As the show moved into its final stretch, the absence of Angelina Jolie at the table was noticeable, even though the panel had clearly transitioned to other topics. That's often how these moments linger on live television. The guest leaves, the cameras keep rolling, but the conversation that happened doesn't immediately disappear. It hangs in the background, shaping how the rest of the episode feels to viewers at home. The panel discussed a few lighter news items, reacting to pop culture headlines and sharing brief opinions. The energy was relaxed, and the studio audience responded as expected, laughing and applauding in familiar rhythms. Still, there was a subtle difference in how the panel interacted. The hosts spoke a little more deliberately, and there were fewer interruptions than usual. It felt like everyone was still grounded by the seriousness of what had unfolded earlier. As the show approached its final segment, the host referenced the importance of respectful conversation, tying it loosely to one of the topics being discussed. It wasn't an explicit callback to Jolie's appearance, but for attentive viewers, the connection was clear. Whoopi nodded along, adding a brief comment about listening as much as speaking. Her tone was calm, and there was no edge to her words. The episode ended with the usual closing remarks, thanking viewers for tuning in and encouraging them to join the conversation online. The studio audience applauded as the credits began to roll. On the surface, it looked like a standard wrap-up. But almost immediately after the episode aired, viewers began reacting. Social media responses started appearing within minutes. Many viewers commented on how unexpected the exchange between Jolie and Whoopi had been, noting that it stood out precisely because it wasn't explosive. Posts described the moment as uncomfortable but honest and praised both women for staying composed. Some viewers sided more with Jolie, appreciating her willingness to push conversations forward, while others resonated with Whoopi's emphasis on audience reception and responsibility. Clips from the segment began circulating online, often accompanied by commentary highlighting specific moments in the conversation. In many cases, the clips focused on the pauses, the body language, and the tone rather than any single quote. Viewers remarked on how rare it felt to see a disagreement unfold without raised voices or dramatic walk-offs. The following day, entertainment news outlets briefly referenced the segment, framing it as a thoughtful on-air disagreement rather than a clash. Headlines emphasized the respectful nature of the exchange, and commentary pieces discussed what it revealed about the challenges of public discourse on daytime television. There was little sensationalism, which matched the tone of what had actually happened. On the next episode of the show, the panel addressed viewer reactions indirectly. The host mentioned that the previous day's conversation had sparked a lot of discussion and thanked viewers for engaging thoughtfully. Whoopi added a short comment about the value of differing perspectives and reiterated that disagreement doesn't have to mean division. Her tone was steady, and the comment was brief. Angelina Jolie didn't respond publicly in detail, but in a later interview, she referenced the importance of open dialogue and expressed appreciation for spaces that allow for nuanced conversation. While she didn't name the show or the exchange explicitly, viewers familiar with the episode recognized the connection. In the days that followed, the moment continued to be discussed among fans of the show. Some viewers said it made them reconsider how they consume and interpret advocacy messages. Others appreciated seeing two experienced public figures navigate a difference of opinion without resorting to defensiveness. Ultimately, the segment didn't end with a definitive resolution, and that was part of what made it memorable. There was no winner, no clear takeaway delivered neatly to the audience. Instead, there was a realistic portrayal of how thoughtful disagreement can play out in real time, especially under the constraints of live television. For many viewers, that authenticity was refreshing. It felt less like a viral moment engineered for clicks and more like a genuine exchange that reflected the complexity of the issues being discussed. The calm tone, the measured responses, and the visible effort to maintain respect all contributed to that impression. And as the conversation continued online and among viewers at home, it reinforced why moments like this stand out on daytime television. They remind audiences that not every disagreement needs to escalate, and that sometimes the most impactful exchanges are the quiet ones that encourage reflection rather than outrage. If you watched that episode or caught the clips afterward, you likely formed your own opinion about the exchange. Was it a necessary conversation? Did one perspective resonate more than the other? Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Table Turn for more narration-based talk show stories.